Hello and welcome to The Hindu. I am Priyali Prakash and you're watching Tipping Point, a weekly show where we dive into climate change events and the trends shaping our future. In this week's episode, we'll take a look at the climate finance issues expected to come up at COP29, floods in Western and Central Africa, and the Chennai Urban Farming Initiative. We are a week away from the 29th Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, commonly called COP29. World leaders and climate experts will gather in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, for the 12-day conference starting November 11th and collectively discuss global efforts to combat climate change. COPs are held annually, and the Baku edition is expected to heavily focus on climate finance. One crucial area of concern expected to be discussed at COP29 is the new Collective Quantified Goal. Mukhtar Babayev, Azerbaijan's Minister of Ecology and Natural Resources and the President-Designate of COP29, call this goal the centrepiece of the upcoming climate conference. The new Collective Quantified Goal builds on the previous $100 billion commitment, which was finalised at COP15, the Copenhagen conference in 2009. According to the previous commitment, developed countries promised to mobilise $100 billion annually to help developing countries mitigate the impact of climate change. This was valid until 2020 and was extended until 2025. In fact, according to a report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development released on May 29, 2024, the $100 billion goal was crossed for the first time in 2022. The idea to set up the new Collective Quantified Goal was first introduced at the 2015 COP21 in Paris. The participating members decided to finalize this goal before 2025, which is when the Copenhagen goal expires. We spoke to Harjeet Singh, Global Engagement Director for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, to understand this better.
So COP29 is being framed as finance COP, and the new climate finance goal is the most important outcome that we are expecting from this conference. The reality is that none of the key issues that we have been working on over the last 3 years have been resolved, starting from quantum, how much the amount is going to be, or the quality, whether it's going to be public finance or grants or loans. All that is yet to be resolved. There's another big question that's hanging, which is around contributor base. And of course, there are other questions like recipient base and who receives the money at the same time, the structure of the goal. So while we have very high expectations and COP29 must deliver, but at the same time, given the progress, we are really concerned whether COP29 is going to meet our expectations.
The main idea of the new Collective Quantified Goal is to address the needs and priorities of developing countries, which have changed drastically over the last decade. According to the UNFCCC, the purpose of the new Collective Quantified Goal is to increase the ability of the world to adapt to adverse impacts of climate change, promote climate resilience, and lower greenhouse gas emissions without threatening food production. The basic goal remains the same. We have to lower global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and preferably limit the global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels if we want to control climate change. The latest emissions gap report, however, says that we are currently way off this limit. The emissions gap report was released on October 24, and it says that with the current policies, the world is on track to warm by around 3.1 degrees Celsius over this century. Most climate commitments for 2030 are not being met, but even if they were, we'd still be looking at a temperature rise limited to around 2.6 to 2.8 degrees Celsius, which is way more than what the Earth would need.
At this moment, we don't see any progress happening on the new climate finance goal. And there are many factors that are playing behind the lack of progress. Of course, the developed countries have not come forward with any indication on the quantum of this new finance goal. And they continue to demand that there should be new contributors from developing countries who should be added. And even they are also trying to narrow the recipient base. So there are many challenging issues that need to be resolved before the COP and at COP29. And where we are right now, it seems extremely challenging whether COP29 will be able to meet our expectations to finalize the new climate finance goal.
Another important climate finance topic expected to come up at COP29 is carbon markets. The Paris Agreement established an international carbon crediting mechanism which allowed countries and companies to transfer carbon credits they earn from reducing their greenhouse gas emissions to other countries to help them meet their climate targets. It allows countries to follow a market-based approach to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. For example, Switzerland has invested in projects abroad to gain points for its own greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategy. It has invested in a fleet of electric buses that operate in Thailand, and the emissions offset from this scheme counts towards emissions reduced by Switzerland, not Thailand.
When we talk about carbon pricing, we definitely have to apply the equity and justice lens there, both between developed and developing countries and within a country between the well-off people and poor people. And that's something that we need to really keep in mind. We have seen some of the policies backfiring even in a developed country like France when they wanted to apply carbon pricing. So I think it's really important to look at how we do that. Of course, there are numbers. In India, we already have a coal cess, which we have been collecting and trying to use that money for clean energy. There are other countries who have tried to implement such measures. So, in fact, there is a proposal from civil society that we should be applying $5 per ton of carbon this year and increase that by $5 every year. That will not only help us go for that transition that is needed, but will also help raise hundreds of billions of dollars that are required both for just transition and also to respond to the climate damages that are happening.
A supervisory body established under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism reached a consensus on standards for a new UN crediting mechanism ahead of COP29 in early October. According to the UNFCCC, the new mechanism will facilitate international cooperation in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The recommendations of the supervisory body will be reviewed at COP29. The carbon market scheme is often criticized by climate experts who argue that this does not stop pollution, just shifts responsibility from one entity to another. The concept is also so new that a lot of questions on credibility, transparency, and the onus of responsibility go unanswered.
Given the history, we have not seen carbon markets really working. First of all, we rely too much on these markets. So if we think that they are going to really help us in reducing emissions at scale, that's not true. What we need is actually regulation and direct action. The other challenge is of greenwashing, and alongside leakage and double counting, which we have seen many companies who claim to operate in carbon market or rely too much on carbon credits don't really take real action. So there are concerns about the environmental integrity of these carbon markets. And of course, from our perspective, there are also equity and justice issues. When we know that governments have played a role in causing the climate crisis from the developed world, they are the ones who need to be actually taking a lot more action in terms of policy and providing finance and also regulating their own private sector. Instead, what they are doing is they are relying on carbon markets or a system that has actually created the problem in the first place. So carbon markets may offer some solution, but they will be only tiny part of that overall framework that we are looking at, which should drive climate action at a scale at which it's needed.
The Loss and Damage Fund is another significant piece of the climate finance puzzle. This essentially is financial support for developing countries, especially the low-income countries and small island developing states, to help them offset the damage caused by extreme weather events and climate disasters. In the run-up to COP29, the board of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage held a series of meetings to fully operationalize the fund, which was established at COP27 held in Egypt in 2022.
First issue related to accountability is to make sure that Loss and Damage Fund reaches that scale that is required. If we have less money, then the challenge is going to be who to allocate and who gets how much. So we need now hundreds of billions of dollars whereas we are barely getting about $700 million, which is definitely not enough. So developed countries have a responsibility to provide money and come up with sources which can help us raise that kind of scale. Second, when we start allocating money, we need to make sure that countries who need more resources and have less capacity are going to be prioritized. So the fund already has a mechanism to have a minimum floor for least developed countries and small island states. But then there are other developing countries who are far more vulnerable, who have very little capacity, who don't belong to those categories. So an allocation framework is now going to be developed, which should put equity and justice and adequacy of money at the very core of the framework to make sure that countries who need resources to recover fully from climate impacts are supported.
The decision on the Loss and Damage Fund's operationalization was adopted at COP28, and following the board's meetings this year, dispersing funds may start in 2025. In his July letter, Babayev said that COP29 will work with countries who have pledged money to the Loss and Damage Fund. He has also called for more contributions to the fund.
The operationalization of the fund, for which there's a separate process ongoing, and 3 board meetings have been conducted and the new executive director has been recruited. So there's going to be a high-level event where the new executive director will be taking a lead along with the board to start looking at some of the issues related to scale of money that is needed, developing the allocation framework, and many other policy issues to help people in developing countries recover from climate impacts.
The Loss and Damage Fund may sound similar to NCQG, but it serves a different purpose. Money from the Loss and Damage Fund is supposed to be used to address irreversible climate impact and disasters in vulnerable countries. NCQG's scope is broader. It can be used for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building efforts too. Loss and damage is more of a compensation, while NCQG can be treated as a preemptive investment.
So at COP29, there are a couple of issues that are going to be discussed with respect to loss and damage. Number one is the inclusion of loss and damage in the new climate finance goal. And for us, that's absolutely fundamental. But we also see a lot of resistance coming from developed countries who only see mitigation and adaptation as part of the new finance goal. For us, loss and damage is a failure of mitigation and inadequate adaptation and should be seen as part of overall climate action. Even it was not there as a standalone finance pillar as part of Paris Agreement, which is exactly the argument that developed countries are making.
More than 5 million people have been affected by flash floods in Central and Western Africa across Cameroon, Chad, Niger, Nigeria, and other countries. According to the United Nations Population Fund, torrential rainfall in the area displaced communities and disrupted essential services. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs is also concerned that floods can lead to cholera outbreaks in the region. Like most extreme weather events, the floods in Africa are also likely to affect women and girls disproportionately. According to the UNFPA, the role of women and girls as primary caregivers can potentially block their access to health services. Conditions of distress can also lead to other problems like lack of medical care for pregnant women, obstetric complications, and even gender-based violence. In September 2024, World Meteorological Organization released a report which found that Africa is disproportionately suffering the effects of climate crisis, and even costs to adapt to changing climate are higher for the continent. African countries are losing around 2 to 5% of their gross domestic product because of the climate crisis. Around 118 million people in Africa could be subjected to extreme heat, floods, and drought by 2030 if the problem is not dealt with adequately. This week's Climate Hope is the Chennai Urban Farming Initiative, a project to utilize rooftops and vacant urban spaces of Chennai for vegetable gardening. The project was conceptualized in 2018 as part of the city's resilience strategy. The Chennai Urban Farming Initiative is an initiative of the Chennai Resilience Center fostered by Resilient Cities Network and Adrian Asht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. The urban food gardens under this initiative are meant to empower local, sustainable food systems. According to the Resilient Cities Network, the Chennai Urban Farming Initiative has been able to encourage beneficiaries, mostly from low-income and vulnerable families, to reduce their food expenditure and have access to fresh produce. Between February and June 2022, one shelter for the homeless reported converting its 100 square feet terrace into a garden that produced around 100 kgs of vegetables and greens. The initiative has reached more than 32,000 people and is working towards ensuring a more equitable access to produce in the city. The Chennai Urban Farming Initiative also distributes mobile vegetable garden kits to families across Chennai to encourage them to start their own vegetable gardens. That's all from this week's Tipping Point. For more videos like this, please subscribe to The Hindu.